Good evening. Great to have you here tonight. Jesse Green, Senior Fellow at the Richman Center. On behalf of the Richman Center, a joint venture of Columbia Law School and Columbia Business School, thank you for joining us tonight. Richman Center promotes evidence-based public policy and fosters dialogue and debate on emerging policy questions where business and markets intersect with the law. Tonight we are going to focus on an issue that is resonating through our society and country and impacted our recent presidential election. The issue is job displacement and what to do about it. The new administration blames globalization, trade deals, and foreign country behavior for stripping out middle-class jobs. The technology is also heavily involved here. This is a complex topic. We're going to get into this with three knowledgeable people who have viewpoints on this topic that we all need to listen to and consider. To my left is Andy Stern. He is the former president emeritus of the 2.2 million member Service Employees International Union. He has been on numerous television programs talking about the impact of tonight's topic and recently published his new book, Raising the Floor: How a Universal Basic Income Can Renew Our Economy and Restore the American Dream. He was a presidential appointee to the Simpson-Bowles Commission and is now a senior fellow here at Columbia. Also here is Stephen Birkenfeld, at the end of the table, a managing director at the investment banking division of Barclays. At Barclays, he chairs the Commitment Committee and Fairness Opinion Committee, co-heads the Clean Tech Initiative, leading the bank's effort for emerging industrial technology companies, and the M&A Group. Prior to Lehman, Stephen was an attorney with Fried Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, advising on mergers and acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. He holds a JD from Columbia Law School and a BA from Cornell. To help us on the economic side is Gad Lebanon, chief economist at the Conference Board. There he oversees the labor market program, the U.S. forecasting program, and Help Wanted Online program at the Conference Board. He created the Conference Board Employment Trend Index and writes a blog for Human Capital Exchange. He has published extensively in academic and professional journals. He holds a PhD from Princeton and undergraduate and graduate degrees from Tel Aviv University. Thank you all for being here tonight. Appreciate it very much. So let's get started. Andy, you want to kick off this discussion tonight?
Sure. First of all, thank Jess and Richard Paul Richman and the Richman Center for the invitation. So I'm going to start with a confession or some context or some guilt to explain to you that you're about to hear me, Exhibit A for the one job in a lifetime economy, who comes from an institution, the American labor movement, that was never well known for thinking about the future, who's going to talk to you about a universal basic income, which I didn't know what it was 2 years ago. So that's my forerunner confession, and I want to also confess that the Columbia Business Press would not publish my book because they thought, A, my economic pedigree, which is true compared to Gad, it was not enough to make as provocative a set of assumptions as I am about to make, and that my solution was so outside the box that it probably wasn't worth anybody buying to listen to or read the book, and so I hope that makes you want to read the book more. So here's my story. So I worked for what I think was the most important middle-class creating institution in the United States for most of my life. I spent 38 years at a union called SEIU. We represent all the janitors in New York City, all the security officers, home care, child care, nursing home workers, all the major hospital non-nursing workers are members of our union. We grew the union during the 14 years I was lucky enough to be president, from about 1 million members to 2.2 million members. We became the fastest growing union in the world, opened offices in 14 countries. We became the largest political action committee in the United States, gave the most amount of money to President Obama in his first election. We spent 5 years before his election preparing to pass a universal health care bill and was very involved in doing that. As Jesse said, I was appointed to the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Oddly, I learned I was the most frequent visitor to the White House in President Obama's first 2 years, which, as an aside, is every time you take the tour, you get credit for a visit. So any of you want to get on the visitors list, take a lot of tours, because you too can be held up in high esteem, and then I quit. I quit my job. And I quit my job because I had spent my whole life trying to change other people's lives. I was now a leader of a major institution, about $1 billion organization with 2.2 million members. And yet, inequality was growing, wages were falling, unions were shrinking, and I didn't really have a plan. And I felt like it was irresponsible to lead an institution with so many people counting on you if you really didn't know where it was going, and you could row a lot harder, but steering was really the question at the time. And I spent a couple of years at Columbia and other places just trying to think and learn and listen to lots of different people, and I discovered three things, which is really what my book is about. One is that we should probably rename the country the United States of Anxiety. 22% of people in America think the economy is very good or good. 58% of Americans don't think their children will be better off than they are, that the American dream is dead, and statistically they are absolutely spot on. And the most astounding number is 47% of Americans couldn't find $400 in case of an emergency, of an unexpected expense. And that was what underwrote certain aspects of this election, along with race and immigration and others. But there is not a coincidence, I believe, that the states that switched their loyalties in this election had a lot to do with the states where the privileged white working class, the industrial union members of the previous generation who had great jobs, great pensions, great health care, great retirement, and saw their kids become the first generation, their family go to college, watch their family and themselves live in a very different situation. And what's happened is that we used to have an American economy that was very simple. The 20th century economy worked like this. If you said the economy was growing, which is what all politicians and business people sort of used as a macro, so to speak, for three other things that were occurring simultaneously. Productivity was growing, wages were growing, and job was growing. So when people say growth, 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 that's what we want, what they really meant is not only do we want growth, but we need productivity, and we need good jobs, and we need wages. And the economy worked pretty well in the 20th century until the last quarter, which we now know in retrospect, the last quarter American workers didn't get a raise. We had the longest period of economic stagnation in terms of wages that we've had in an extraordinarily long period of time. People actually worked more hours and made less money, and that included college graduates. And so all of a sudden, when we talked about growth, what we were really saying was GDP growth, productivity growth, job growth, but no wage growth. And what we haven't realized that the 21st century economy is when you say growth, you only get GDP growth and productivity growth. Not only do you not get wage growth, but you don't get job growth. In fact, there has not been one new net full-time regular job in America since 2005. All of the growth has been in a part-time economy, and sadly, much of the growth since the recession in 2007 has been in the low-wage economy. So what I learned was, probably took a long time to understand what a lot of people knew well before me, is that we live in an economy that people are incredibly anxious, where the future doesn't look very good, and that the old things that used to work in the American economy, meaning the market, meaning unions, meaning the government, were no longer providing the economic stability that people were hoping for. Two, I learned what everybody probably knows by now, but took me a little while. I'm a slow learner to learn that 30% of the economy, people now work in contingent, part-time, not have a full-time relationship with an employer. My father, my grandfather, and I all worked basically for one employer my whole life. My son, who's 30, has had 9 jobs. On average, people will have 9 to 12 jobs by the time they're 35. So the second thing we now realize is that we went from a employer-managed economy to a self-managed economy. And the employer used to manage your pension and does well at Columbia, your pension, your retirement, your career, your training, your education. And now we have a self-managed economy, which is very complicated for people to manage, particularly if you're an Uber driver, people that are really not self-employed in a full-time kind of relationship and are trying to figure out your taxes and your expenses and where do you get a pension, Social Security or unemployment or disability insurance. And so I like to say that the summary of the differences of the economy is that today Facebook is the largest media company in the world. It produces no content. Airbnb is the largest accommodation company in the world. It owns no rooms. Uber is the largest transportation company in the world. It has no cars. And Alibaba and Amazon are the largest retailers in the world. They have no stores, although Amazon may have some stores in the near future. So that's today's American economy. And all of that is actually solvable, except for the third thing that I learned is there is now incredible amount of reputable research, even more so than when I wrote my book, from people that advise companies and countries. The McKinsey Global Institute, 45% of all tasks that is done at work today can be eliminated right now by existing technology. 10 to 15% more of artificial intelligence is deployed commercially. Oxford University, 47% of all jobs can be eliminated in the next 20 years as a result of automation, software technology, AI. Boston Consulting Group, a low liar, they say the numbers are in the 20% in OECD countries. The World Bank has just published a report that India and China face over 2/3 of their jobs being lost as a result of automation. The ILO this year issued a report saying that in Cambodia and Vietnam, in footwear, clothing, and textile, the heart of the economies of those countries, the job losses will be in the 70 and 80% in the next decade. We now have people all over Silicon Valley expressing their concern about the role that technology will have in disrupting the labor market. And so we now have an enormous amount of reputable research. We have Angus Deaton, the current Nobel Prize winner, joined together with Joe Stiglitz here at Columbia University, along with Robert Reich, along with conservatives, all saying the same thing. There is a huge probability that there will be a massive disruption, a tsunami of disruption in the labor market, and that people will have harder and harder times getting good jobs and decent income. So then the question is, the last thing I want to say is, so what do we do? So if I was at Columbia, I'd say what we do is we have a debate. We would have a debate about whether or not this time is different, because that's a totally fair debate to have. Because in previous industrial revolutions, there were more jobs at the end of it there was in the beginning of it. And that people like me were called Luddites, people that wanted to destroy machines and didn't want to allow for progress. And I think that's totally fair to cite history as being an important consideration. I also remind people that when I went to college, I think Neptune or Pluto wasn't the planet, but one of them isn't right now, and that the world was flat until Columbus thought it was round, and that lots of science has disproved the previous conventional theory. So, we shouldn't always think because things have happened a certain way to a certain moment, it will never change. But we all should understand that each of those revolutions was enormously devastating in the transition. That the Industrial Revolution, read Charles Dickens or look at what happened to child labor in the early parts of the 20th century, it was a very unpleasant transition. So I don't really want to debate the future. If I really thought someone I knew the future, I'd bet on the stock market, I'd bet on basketball games, I'd use their future prescience, for something more important in terms of making money. What I want to do is what the military and business does every single day, which is faced with a problem, they create scenarios. They don't have to decide, is someone going to weaponize smallpox? Is ISIS going to attack the United States? Is Obamacare going to be eliminated or not eliminated? They prepare scenarios to respond to all risks, foreign and domestic, all risks to the business, to the shareholders. They are responsible planners because they don't have to decide the future. They have to prepare for alternative scenarios. And I think that is the situation the United States finds themselves. The President of the United States today in the New Yorker magazine talked again, the second time he's talked in the last 3 weeks, about that the social compact that we have today is not working. We're going to have a different debate. And actually in his previous interview in Wired magazine talks about a universal basic income, which I want to talk about now. So what do we do? So there are lots of different ideas of what we do. I have a very simple idea. It's actually a very old idea, and in fact it's nothing like my idea because it's Thomas Paine's idea. So Thomas Paine, at the end of the Revolutionary War, when America was going to decide what to do with all the land they had expropriated from the British, having been the victors in the war, knew that they were going to sell the land back to private hands. But Thomas Paine believed we should compensate every citizen $15 pounds sterling for the rest of the country's history, which we had no idea how long it was going to last at the time, but in terms of for the common property that the country owned and was now turning over to private hands. That was somewhat the beginning of the American version of a universal basic income. It didn't find its life and voice again until, of all things, Milton Friedman, an icon of the conservative movement, and Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, actually introduced a universal basic income, a guaranteed income, in 1969. They would guarantee every citizen $10,000 a year. It passed the House of Representatives. It was experimented in 5 cities in the United States. And the only reason that we didn't turn it into law was because the Democrats in the Senate thought, boy, when we get rid of this guy Nixon, we're going to get a Democrat to control everything, and then we'll get $12,000 a year, so they voted against a guaranteed basic income, and instead we built today's current welfare system, which has 123 cash transfer programs and is very categorical. There's housing money, and there's food money, and there's other kinds of money, and that's our current welfare system. And the biggest critic of our current welfare system, of all people, was Martin Luther King, who in his last book, From Chaos to Community, wrote that the civil rights movement asked you to end poverty. We didn't ask you for a housing program and an EITC program and a welfare program. We asked you to end poverty. And he called upon the president to not build this current welfare system, but he said, if you want to end poverty, give people money. And that is the basis of a universal basic income. It's a program whose name actually says it all. It's universal, meaning it's a grant given to every single American, from Bill Gates to the least amongst us. It is basic in the sense that it's really not a substitute for work. It's a supplement to work. It's $1,000 a month. Why $1,000 a month? Because right now we have 50 million people in the United States in poverty, according to the federal government. The federal poverty line is $11,997 for an individual. $1,000 a month for all of the math people here is $12,000 a year, which would take every American out of poverty. So we would do 2 things simultaneously. We would take every American out of poverty, and we provide a floor, a level of stability that actually has lots of other positive consequences. A, it compensates mostly women who've taken care of kids without compensation their whole life. It would allow people who are in abusive relationships with their boss, with their spouse, to walk away because they would have resources. It would allow workers to go on strike because they actually have their own little strike fund. It would allow people to become entrepreneurs because the dirty little secret of Silicon Valley is there's no son and daughter of my janitors and childcare workers living in the garages. They're all people whose parents have means that allow them to live for a year or 2 or 3 without any other income. And the reason I know it actually will work is because people like me and all of my friends are experimenting with a parental basic income. And a parental basic income is when your parents pay for your housing a little bit, take you on vacation, take care of a problem you have when you have a bill. Those are parents who provide appropriate stability to their kids. And that stability I can provide to my son makes his life a lot different than his friends' life. It makes him allowed to take risks, to switch jobs, to go back to school, because he has a level of support. And my question is, why doesn't every American have the same level of support? So I'll end by saying this. Change, I like to say, is inevitable. It's progress that's optional. And the universal basic income is an answer to, or a scenario, and there may be many more, and I hope there are, because I always like to say, as Churchill said about democracy, about UBI, it's a terrible idea until you try everything else. And so what I say to people is, let's have a debate about the future based on the reality that a tsunami of change is coming our way, or at least there's a high probability of it. And we need to prepare for it. That's what responsible citizens and responsible elected officials do for their constituencies. And let's have the debate. And if you have a better answer than a universal basic income, bring it on, because the country desperately needs it. Thanks.
Andy, thank you. You know, globalization and technology have come at us pretty fast. I worked at a global technology company, and I saw a rapid change both in terms of where jobs were developing and where they were shrinking, as well as how technology was being applied. And the question is this, number one, global, truly global outside the United States, and also how is this going to continue at this rate and pace? Gad, maybe you can give us your views on this.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. I do a lot of work on labor markets, although I've never been in the White House even once, not even as a tourist, so I didn't get any insights from there. I have slightly, or more than slightly, different opinions about the U.S. labor market than Andy has, that I'm going to share with you here. Although I think I understand where he's coming from. Because if I was talking to you now in 2010, I was probably would also be much more concerned about the U.S. labor market than I am now. Between the late 1990s and 2010, we had probably the largest employment displacement in the history of the country in such a short time, about 10, 12 years. A tremendous amount of jobs, a number of jobs were lost, a lot of that because of offshoring, a lot of it because of trade penetration that caused a lot of jobs to shut down, and a lot of it was because of technological progress and automation that lowered the need for workers. So I think in 2010 we were in a very abysmal labor market condition that I think should have raised or created a lot of thinking about radical solutions. But I think now that we're in the end of 2016, I think my perspective is a little different because a lot of change since between 2010 and 2016. A lot of the trends that caused this large employment displacement were actually reversed. So we had massive offshoring. Now we have a fraction of that, almost no new offshoring in the United States. We had massive import penetration. In recent years, imports as a share of GDP is more or less flat. We had a huge technological progress and automation. In the past 6 years, labor productivity growth is the lowest it's ever been in a 6-year period. So it didn't just slow down, it actually became the lowest growth rate in labor productivity since in recorded times and perhaps ever. And all of those things made a big difference. And on top of that, it turned out that those years happen exactly at the same time when baby boomers are retiring. So you all know that the baby boomers are a huge generation, and they are now retiring, and they're creating a lot of job openings, and they are likely to continue to retire for 15 more years in large numbers. So as a result of all of that, if you look at the labor market now and compare it to 2010, it's completely different. The unemployment rate is not 10%, it's less than 5%. The time to fill a position, which is kind of a measure related to the tightness of the labor market, is higher than it was, way higher than it was before the recession. Even wages, they have been stagnant for a long time, but just last week, the Atlanta Fed, they keep a measure where they track the same people over a 12-month period, and this measure reached 3.9%, which is almost as fast as it was before the recession. You also see job satisfaction, there are measures of that, they are also moving up, and labor participation is finally, people are starting to realize that the labor market is better and are coming back to the labor market. So I think but I have to add, at the same time, while in many dimensions the labor market is becoming healthy, there is still a very large group of people who are left behind. And at the same time, the short-term unemployment is historically low, long-term unemployment rate remains high. The number of people who, for example, are claiming to be on disability is historically high. So it's not that the labor market is healthy everywhere, but I would say in most places it is beginning to be a healthy labor market. Now, not only that, I would say if you look at the next 15 years or more, I think there are also, as I mentioned before, it's very hard to predict the future. But one thing that is pretty certain is that the baby boomers are going to continue to retire in large numbers. Very few people beyond the age of 70 are remaining in the workforce, and that's probably not going to change dramatically. Now, I think a big open question is what will happen to productivity growth. And I think that's a key to this story. And I think, as Andy mentioned, it's very hard to predict the future. And I'll give you an example. So one of the topics that is very much in the front of this discussion about technology is driverless cars. There are a lot of drivers in this country, a few million, and if all of them are going to lose their job, or many of them, that will certainly create employment displacement. So in the past year, I've been in many presentations that I give and forums that I speak with. I ask my colleagues and people I talk to, I ask them the following question. In how many years from now there will be completely driverless cars in Manhattan? And by completely driverless, I mean no one is in the car. It's an empty car going from one place to another. And I get a very large variation in answers. I get anywhere between 3 years and 50 years. And when and I talk to people who are in the industry or kind of so-called experts, I get from 5 years to 50 years. So, so what do I take from that? I think, and this is a topic that almost everyone is reading about or talking about. It's not like a question about an obscure software that may or may not replace underwriting in some insurance industry that really very few people can have an opinion on. This is a question that many people are very informed about. So when you get such a large range of answers, to me, the main message I take from it is that it's impossible to forecast how quickly technology is going to replace workers. Now, so is there nothing that we can say? Well, the only thing that I personally trust is what's happening now. And what's happening now is that, as I mentioned before, in the past 6 years, labor productivity is 0.5%, which is historically low. So it could be that there will be some dramatic change and that labor productivity will start growing very rapidly, but it may not be the case, and I really don't know that anyone can talk confidently about the answer to that. So therefore, I think my conclusion is that there is high likelihood that the labor market in the United States in the next 10, 20 years is actually going to be in pretty good conditions in most areas. I think, and so what should be done, I think, is dealing with the areas that are left behind. And there I saw a shocking, to me it was a shocking statistic. I looked at the percent of people who are claiming to be disabled under the age of 65 by state. And where in most states the share is 4 or 5% of the population under 65 are claiming to be on disability or claiming to be disabled. In states like West Virginia and Kentucky and Mississippi and Alabama, that's almost 20%. And this is an astronomical number, and I think that's where the tragedy is. Not just in those states, but there are a lot of communities where job losses have been massive in recent decades, where that are left behind, and there I don't think could heal by themselves. And I think there the solution to the labor market should be there, how to take care of those areas, how to either bring more jobs there, either physical jobs or remote working. I think that's a potential solution. We are now going to be in the first time where we have a tight labor market and advanced technologies for working remotely. I think the last time we had a tight labor market, we didn't have Skype. So now we can do much more in remote working. And I think also finding ways to increase population mobility. If some community or city has no prospects, why Why all the people have to stay there? Why is there something that could be done to move people to areas that have more jobs? So I think that's where I think solutions to the labor market conditions should come from. And, that's just one of many problems. I'm not saying that the U.S. economy is by any means in a good shape. Just in the post-election survey that Reuters did, they found that 72% agree that American economy is rigged to advantage the rich and the powerful. And I think the reason why so many people think that way is probably it's true. And I think that's an area that I think there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, thank you. And just a comment, Stephen, before I turn to you. It was my observation that having worked in, again, a global multinational company in technology for a lot of years, that when I started with them way back in the 70s, actually, we had a lot of retraining programs. People lost their jobs because of technology shift. The company always retrained them. In fact, we had a no-layoff policy that went on for many, many, many years, many decades, actually. And competition became more severe, and globalization opened up the United States to competition and opened up the opportunities also for the global tech companies. The cost of retraining rose to the point where it was not affordable, and instead the company moved to where we just lay people off and then hire the technology and skills we need. Do we need to go back to training and retraining to bring some of these people that are claiming to be disabled back into the marketplace and to help the people that are going to be subject to some of these pressures in the future? What's your view on that?
So we've covered a lot, and we'll address that. I say, at least for this panel, it seems like I'm the deciding vote here. So I have to say up front, I cast my vote with Andy. And I'll cover a lot of different issues. We can start off with the training issue. There are companies out there right now who are complaining that they can't find workers for their open positions while they're laying off other workers, right? And so I always say that any company that says that they can't find workers to fill the jobs that they have open is leaving out at the price we want to pay for them, right? Because if you just pay up more, if you pay engineers like bankers and lawyers, there won't be a shortage of engineers. And so the training issue, which is a very easy fix to this, and people talk about STEM education too, those are supply side issues. What we have is a demand issue, right? If there's an issue about a demand for workers, open jobs. And so creating more supply, giving a lot more people with STEM education is just a way for corporations to get the skills they need without having to pay more for them. Not much different than the views of most technology companies on what we should be doing with visa programs. Because if I can bring in a lot of talented people from India and China, right, brings in more supply, keeps the price down. And just you asked a good question to start off. Is this truly global? And my answer is not yet, but it will be. I think right now it's most interesting, most pertinent to talk about it as a U.S. issue. Because there are U.S. companies that are engaging every year in what I call productivity layoffs. They just have figured out they can do more with less, and so they lay off a few thousand more employees. Even though they have record stock prices and record levels of cash and highest profitability they've ever had, they're still laying off workers. Do you think you could do that in Israel or Germany or China or Brazil or just name any other country in Europe without political and media outrage? That the largest companies, some of these companies have gone to the extent where they've laid off and announced the layoff of a few thousand workers, and at the same time have announced multi-billion-dollar stock buybacks. And we just say, our Wall Street environment says that's great. Fewer stocks, more earnings per share. You're more productive at the corporate level, so nobody complains about it. So right now, I'll just give you one of many examples. You can't pump your own gas in Brazil. Not because it's unsafe, but they figured out that would cost about 25,000 jobs. Now, that's changing for lots of different reasons, and we can go into that more if you want. But there were things that Dad said that we've talked about before, and I just, fundamentally disagree with. One of which is posing it as, will technology replace workers? And it's this concept of replacing, that there'll be a driverless car and there goes that job, right? We don't need bank tellers anymore, we don't need cashiers, we don't need radiologists. And I prefer to talk about it, as Andy mentioned it, as displacing jobs, which means that people are becoming more and more productive, that you can handle a lot more flow of whatever it is you're choosing to do because you have information technology at your disposal. Just think about, with a lot of students in the room, if you have to do research, you just Google it. Within seconds, you have all your source material. That would take weeks when I was in school, having to go to the library and dig that out. The amount of productivity increase from that is enormous. I don't even know you can put a multiplier on it. It's just one thing after another that you can do so much quicker because we're all connected. We have all this information available to us. You don't even know. It was somebody's full-time job to try to set up a meeting of 10 people. Because one would call, I have a conflict, and now I got to call all 10 people again and see what their schedules are, right? Those were called secretaries. There were receptionists, jobs like that. When we talk about it, because we're so fascinated by the science fiction of this, and will there be driverless cars, we lose sight of all of the displacement that technology can cause. So I say forget about whether there's driverless cars or not, and just realize that we already have the technology, if it were in every vehicle, to eliminate, let's say, 90% of the accidents, right? Because there's lane deviation, and there's automatic braking, and these cars have all this technology that they can make sure that you don't hit something else. And if you just eliminate 90% of the accidents, forgetting the productivity you get because we don't have traffic jams and all that, just think about the hundreds of thousands of people who are employed in the automobile insurance industry, right? Every time you have a claim, settling that claim, fixing the car, the body shops, right? On any kind of technological innovation, start thinking, start looking around and say, wow, there used to be a person that did that when I made an appointment with my doctor. There's no person doing that anymore. I see so many business models, especially around corporate infrastructure, right? Your payroll, your billing and receivables, especially in things like healthcare, your data centers, your call centers, your cybersecurity, your compliance, all of that is being outsourced. And the job loss, when you look at the numbers of how many took to do that as an independent company relative to how many employees those companies have with hundreds of clients, you easily can get to 80, 90% job loss in those positions. And the really interesting piece of this to me is the comment I've heard, and I've heard from God before too, that labor productivity is not happening. And I just say we must be measuring it incorrectly. Because on a macro level it's not happening, but I don't know, and I'd love to hear if somebody had an example of at the micro level, at the organizational level, at the university level, at the hospital level, at any kind of company, that they are not able to do more with less people. Whatever more may be. You want to say more revenue, teach more students, take care of more patients, produce more widgets. Every organization I know of is able to do more of whatever it is they're doing with fewer people involved. So at the micro level, the productivity has increased enormously. Now, how labor productivity is measured, how GDP is measured in an information world, where GDP to me is, this is a table, it's solid, we can measure it. I don't know how we measure all of the energy we put into media and information. I don't understand. I'm not an economist. But I know at a micro level, there's enormous gains in productivity in every organization. I also find it interesting, two other points, this concept about baby boomers retiring. And I don't know an organization that is looking at it and say, I've got people retiring, oh great, I'll go hire somebody else. What they're doing is, okay, somebody's retiring, right? They have a department of 10 people. One's retiring, okay, can I manage with 9? That's the first decision, or 8, or 7, right? I don't replace anybody. If I can't do that, is there a way to automate this? right? Is there a way to outsource it? Let somebody else do it for me, and I have less labor costs. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I want to have less labor. Can I hire somebody part-time to do it? Can I hire an independent contractor to do it? I go through that whole hierarchy of decisions, and if the answer no through all of that, with all the options available, then you hire a full-time employee, right? Only then. And so I don't think, besides the question of when the baby boomers really will retire with all the economic stress they have living into their 90s and how they're going to pay for that, I don't think people are retiring at 68 or 70 anymore. But, we'll see. I do think that organizations, any CEO you talk to, they're saying, okay, somebody retired, let's just hire somebody else in. I also think that there's a lot of discussion on income inequality and the consequences of it and how destabilizing it. And there's very little discussion about what's causing it. To me, this is a question about you throw off the equilibrium, you take jobs out of the equation, and therefore all the leverage goes to profits and capital and away from wages. And one of the more interesting statistics, God tell me if this is no longer correct, is that wages are at the lowest percentage of GDP that they've been since we've been reporting it, and profits and shareholder returns are at the highest level of GDP than they have been.
Some of the other anecdotal things that you mentioned, that was true a few years ago, but not anymore.
Okay. So, I put this, well, maybe think about it a little differently. We could have this debate, all of us, about whether there'll be more work for people in the future or not. I don't think there will be. I think we are seeing the start of this ever-accelerating momentum tide of losing workers. But I think there are three things that there is generally consensus on in all these discussions. I'll finish with this. The first is that this transition, whatever it will be, is going to be very disruptive, like they have been in the past, especially for younger workers and for older workers. And so we've got to figure out how we're going to manage through this transition to whatever the future around work is going to be. The second is, because of technology, we're going to get increased polarization. There may be more work, but it'll fit into the category of high-pay work or low-pay work, and there'll be much less in the middle. And the way things are playing themselves out, and the way I'd expect, is many fewer people going to the high-wage work and more people going to low-wage work. So we're going to get further income inequality, further polarization, which again has a whole bunch of different consequences, and 30% is going to 50% pretty soon. I don't know too many people who would argue that work is packaged differently, and it's going from a W-2 full-time job into independent contractors, freelancers, just-in-time workers, task performers. You can talk about the gig economy, the sharing economy, but instead of having a W-2 and the security and the benefits and the ability to get a mortgage and all the things that go with it, we're having people who are going to figure out ways to cobble together a living. And as Andy said, instead of the employer responsible for this, they're going to be responsible for it themselves. And that has enormous policy implications for health care, for retirement, for basic benefits. It's interesting to have a discussion about, paid parental leave. But if you don't have a job, if you are driving an Uber car, if you're doing tasks, if you're just an independent contractor, you don't get any kind of paid leave, right? And that's where the economy is moving. So even if we just push off the issue of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, will there be more or less work? We are seeing these very significant trends in the workforce and the way that companies are managing their workforce that lead to also to really serious policy implications, which can be addressed many different ways, maybe, but UBI seems to be one of the ones that cover it in the most holistic way.
Thank you, Steve. Just a question for the panel here. How does the rest of the world hold this tide off? We talk about Europe saying, not here, okay? You can't lay off people here. How can that possibly occur with the United States in a headlong rush into this?
Well, in Europe, they don't lay people off as easily, but they don't hire people as easily in any kind of task. So there you see the bulk of it being in terms of people entering the workforce and trying to find good jobs. But it's the same issues, right? So at some point, people do retire or die, and then there'll be attrition and bring it down. But they're not as able, because there's more of a cost involved to just lay people off.
So it's going to be a long, slower process behind the United States.
And in many ways, perhaps a more destabilizing one, because it's bad when your older workers are unemployed, but it may be worse when your younger workers are unemployed in terms of what direction they go to if they don't have hope of getting a good job.
Right. Go ahead, please.
I think there is a lot of variation when you say the rest of the world. So I think there are some countries where the labor market is ill, terminally ill, and like Greece or Spain or Italy even, and Portugal, where I think there is almost a lost generation and very high youth unemployment and things like that. And then there are countries like Germany, who probably have a tighter labor market than the US has, and they have a much less demographic, favorable demographic condition. So I think it varies significantly by country.
Annie, your idea, of course, with the recent election, it looks like we're going a totally different direction. We're going to go try to stimulate the U.S. economy and do various methods to get the jobs going again. It seems to me the opportunity to bring your idea forward in a legislative sense is going to be deferred for a period of time. Who knows how long, given what's happening. What's your view on that?
So, I'd say two things. One, I hope someone does everything they can to find as much work for people that can't find it or don't have it, like infrastructure. So I'm not, there are short, middle, and long-term solutions. I wouldn't think that a UBI is the best solution right now. I think there are other things one could do, but I think we're overestimating, how much stimulus will create demand for good jobs. So, if you have more people working at Walmart or you have more people working at Denny's, you decide whether creating more low-wage jobs is really what's going to make the American workers feel better about their future, or more contingent part-time and temporary work where you don't have Social Security and you don't have workers' comp and you don't have disability. But I hope we try to create demand and give people money to spend. So I think that's all good. I think if you think about what Paul Ryan talks about, which are block grants, the next step from block grants to the states is, rather than giving it back as tax cuts, giving it back as universal basic income, which is what Alaska did with its oil revenues it got from the North Shore. It gave everyone a dividend rather than giving the government money and letting the government spend it. So I think it's an odd moment because kind of the libertarian strain of, government can't do anything right, so we should give the money back to the people, combined with Paul Ryan giving money back to the states, is an interesting political dynamic that I'm not sure how it plays out. But, it's probably, it's something that people that are interested in this. I think the American experiment with universal basic income is going to happen for, political reasons because of Justin Trudeau across the border, who's actually experimenting with universal basic income, and no offense meant to, President Trump, or President-elect Trump, or Secretary Clinton, but they're a little older than Justin Trudeau, and he seems to have a more future-oriented vision of the world, and they're experimenting with a child grant as well as a basic income in Ontario. And I actually think there will be a very strong push sometime in the future, at least in states, to do something about a universal basic child grant for kids 0 to 5. Because I think we're now learning that brain research says that so much of educational attainment actually occurs before their school. And we're not going to build schools from 0 to 5, and pre-K has turned out not to have enduring educational advantages. And there's a self-fulfilling prophecy only because I know people that are beginning to organize around this question of, could we take existing programs and add more money and provide every child parents of children 0 to 5 with tools to allow them to have better chances for their kids to succeed.
One comment on that. My son runs a charter school in the Marlboro section of the Bronx. We opened about 2 years ago.
That's great.
And one of the things he's found out as a result of doing that project and forming school, we're up to about 250 students at this point in 6th and 7th grades, is that in terms of education of kids, you have to not just educate the kids, you have to educate the parents. Because in a lot of these neighborhoods, the parents don't even know what to do. They want to make differences for their kids, but they don't even know how to go about it. Like creating a workspace at home and how to help the child do homework. A lot of them are not capable of even doing that. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in this area if we're going to make something like this work. Even giving them money is just not going to do it. We're going to have to find some way of giving them the training so that they know how to bring value to their children.
It's just one of the complications. Education in our country is very localized.
Yes.
It's not like that in much of the rest of the world.
You know.
Well, I didn't comment on UBI. I have to admit that I kind of have I know that it's a bad idea, and now I have to try to come up with reasons why. No, so so I have more. It's not an area that I studied very carefully, so I have more questions than answers. But I did kind of a little calculation. I hope that I was right. But if $12,000 per year for more than 300 million people, that gets close to $4 trillion a year, which is like 20 or 25% of our GDP. So just from a practical perspective, how is it going to work?
Just since you're the economist, we could not live with all this fuzzy math. So $10,000 a year, $12,000 a year comes out for 18 to 64-year-olds who are citizens of the country. Comes out, and not for people on Social Security, so we're not double dipping, is about $1.75 trillion a year. There's currently $1.3 trillion in tax expenditures. There's $1.1 trillion in welfare programs, and that's before you get to the military or ask yourselves, we used to have a transaction tax in this country. We stopped doing it. Europe is doing it again. Or carbon taxes. We're the only OECD country that doesn't have a VAT tax. There's plenty of money if we want to do it, and we will do it when, just like we did at different times in history when there is social instability in this country, in the same way we bailed out the banks, or we acted after 2009, the savings and loan 2009. When there is social instability, if things start happening in the streets at a level that we haven't seen since the 60s, people will find all that money to buy and their risk of their own security, for their own assets.